Hello everyone, Prosperity here. We now have a lot of hours in the Legion expansion under our belts, and as such, I'd like to keep this series going to help you better understand the changes that have been made to our classes and specializations. With that said, welcome to the core combat overview for the Balance Druid in Legion. This video will be focusing on the spells available in the Balance spellbook and will be broken up into 4 parts: damage, utility, passives, and cooldowns. Learning what these spells do and how they work together is very important to starting down your path to mastering the specialization. Before we get started, I wanted to talk about the new resource that Balance has to manage, Astral Power. This resource is built up and spent through your main damaging abilities, with some of your harder hitting spells costing or generating more than others. The goal with this resource is to never cap it, always keeping your Astral Power balanced between your generators and spenders. Let's start off with the core damage spells shown on screen here. These 6 spells are your bread and butter, so learning how to use them effectively to manage your Astral Power is your top priority. Lunar Strike is your main AoE spell. It has a baseline 2.5 second cast time and will generate 15 Astral Power when successfully cast against an enemy. A successful cast of this spell will deal a moderate amount of arcane damage to your primary target and a low amount of damage to all other enemies within 5 yards of that target. Using this spell effectively will require you cast this on the target in the middle of a very tightly positioned group, so try to save it for those situations. Moonfire is your main damage over time spell. Casting this on an enemy target will generate 3 Astral Power and will deal a low amount of arcane damage to your target instantly and an additional chunk of arcane damage over 22 seconds. This is a fantastic spell to spam while you're on the move, but your damage will suffer greatly for doing so while stationary. Solar Wrath is your main single target Astral Power generator and filler. It has a 1.5 second cast time baseline and will generate 10 Astral Power when successfully cast, also dealing some nature damage to your target. If you don't have enough Astral Power to use your spenders, this spell should be cast as much as possible in single target situations. Starfall is your main AoE Astral Power spender. It costs 60 Astral Power to use, and when activated will allow you to choose a 10-yard area on the ground that will last for 8 seconds. All enemies inside this area will take a moderate amount of astral damage while inside. Any enemies hit by Starfall will also get a debuff called Stellar Empowerment, which lasts for the duration of Starfall. This effect will increase the damage of Moonfire and Sunfire on all affected targets by a baseline 20%. Once you cast Starfall, there is no need to refresh your Moonfire and Sunfire immediately, as they will automatically get the increased damage. You should keep an eye on your Moonfire and Sunfire to make sure you get the full 8 seconds of this buff. Star Surge is your main single target Astral Power spender. It costs 40 Astral Power to use and is instant cast, and when activated will deal a hefty amount of astral damage to the target. Successfully casting a Star Surge will also grant you Lunar and Solar Empowerments, which can each be stacked up to 3, with the buffs lasting for 40 seconds. This effect will consume 1 stack of the buff whenever the next Solar Wrath or Lunar Strike is cast, boosting the damage of the spell by a baseline 20%. Note that clipping one of these casts with Star Surge will not give you the effect for that cast, as the buff only applies when Star Surge reaches the target. A general rule of thumb is that Star Surge should not be cast if you have 3 stacks of either of these, unless you're at max Astral Power and need to get rid of some immediately. Sunfire is very similar to Moonfire, but with the damage over time effect being slightly weaker in damage and with a shorter duration. This spell also grants 3 Astral Power when used, but instead of just affecting your main target, all enemies within 5 yards of your target will also have the damage over time effect applied to them. While this spell is much more effective in AoE situations, it's still a good idea to keep it on your primary target, regardless of how many enemies are around it. With the damage abilities out of the way, let's move on to the core utilities, shown on screen. These 6 spells won't directly affect your damage output, but using them effectively will help you to go the distance in any situation. Shapeshifting gives you the ability to change into different beast forms that grant added utility to your toolkit, basically becoming a lesser version of one of your other 3 specs while in one of the forms. In a raiding environment, you will almost never use anything other than your Moonkin form, with an exception for Cat form to get a 30% movement speed increase. It's also good to note that while shapeshifted, you will be immune to polymorph effects, and switching forms will remove any snares or slows on you. With all that said, let's just talk about Moonkin form for now. While in this form, your armor is increased by 200%, as well as all arcane and nature damage you deal increased by 10%. You'll also have a 15% chance to make your next damaging spell instant cast when you take a single target attack. As I said earlier, you should try to remain in Moonkin form as much as you possibly can while in combat. Entangling Roots is your main crowd control spell. It has a 2-second cast time baseline, and when cast will keep the target in place for 30 seconds. This is very useful against melee based enemies, but is only useful against ranged enemies if you're running far away from them. Note here that any damage from any source on a rooted target has a high chance of cancelling the effect. Healing Touch is your only baseline source of health regeneration as a Balance Druid. It has a 2.5-second cast time, and when cast will heal a friendly target for a pretty good chunk of health. The spell will not take you out of Moonconform to cast, so you should feel free to cast it if you need to in order to stay alive, or to help keep a group member alive. Remove Corruption immediately removes all curse and poison effects from a friendly target on an 8-second cooldown. Even though you aren't a healer, you should try to help your healers out on fights with these dispellable effects. You'll never have to worry about your own mana, but doing this will save your healers their mana, which in turn will help them keep you alive longer. Solar Beam is your interrupt ability, placing a 3-yard area around your target that will silence all enemies within it when activated. This beam will last for 8 seconds and is castable on a 1-minute cooldown. The trick here is to have the enemies not move, which is perfect when coupled with an Entangling Roots. Now that we're done with the utilities, let's take a look at the core passives, shown on screen here. These abilities don't have any direct impact on how your spells work together, but they boost the effectiveness of your other spells quite substantially. In addition to the 2 passives we'll cover here, you'll also receive a 3rd one depending on the talent you take in the 3rd tier, but we'll talk about that in the next video. Astral Influence is a passive that simply increases the range of all spells in your spellbook by 5 yards. This doesn't sound that great, but it allows for you to have a lot more wiggle room when in an encounter, especially in the larger boss rooms. This passive also makes you more able than most other ranged classes to kite enemies thanks to the improved distance. Your mastery, Starlight, simply increases the damage of Starfall and Star Surge, as well as the Lunar, Solar, and Stellar empowerments by a baseline 16%, increasing with the mastery stat on your gear. There's not much to say about this passive on its own, but it does make the mastery stat look a little overpowered for us. Lastly, let's take a look at the core cooldowns for Balance, shown on screen for you here. These are all much more powerful and can be used a lot less frequently than all of the other spells we've seen so far, and learning when the appropriate time to use them could mean the difference between a kill or a wipe for you. Barkskin is your only defensive cooldown, instantly reducing all damage you take by 20% for 12 seconds on a 1-minute cooldown. 2 things to note about this spell is that while active, it will prevent pushback on your spells when taking damage, and is usable while in any crowd control effect, as well as while in any shapeshift form. Proper use of this spell changes from fight to fight, but should be used as much as possible to help your healers keep you alive when you're taking excessive damage. Celestial Alignment is your only damage cooldown. It's got a 3-minute cooldown, and when activated will increase the damage of all spells you cast by 30% and the amount of astral power generated by your Solar Wrath and Lunar Strike by 50%, all for 15 seconds. This should be used at the beginning of every fight after you have your dots rolling, and then again as soon as it's off cooldown, unless you won't be able to deal damage for the full 15 seconds. Dash is your main mobility cooldown, instantly switching you into cat form and increasing your movement speed by an additional 70% for 15 seconds. This should not be used unless you need to travel a long distance to get out of the way of something, as you can simply switch into cat form for the 30% speed increase. Be sure to switch back into Moonconform immediately when you've gotten out of the way to keep yourself from losing any damage, but note that you will lose the movement speed increase as soon as you leave cat form. Innervate has a 3-minute cooldown and can only target friendly healers. Activating this spell on a healer will allow them to cast all spells freely without spending mana for 10 seconds, which will help them to keep going in any encounter for longer to help keep you alive. Be sure to communicate with your healers to coordinate when to use the spell, as they may not be able to make the full use out of the Innervate in some situations. Rebirth is your battle resurrection spell. It has a 10-minute cooldown, and when used on a dead group member will allow them to resurrect with 60% health and 20% mana. This is a strong resurrection effect that is also usable while in combat. As with Innervate though, you'll need to coordinate with your raid team to be sure that the right person gets resurrected. Typically this is best reserved for tanks or healers. In some cases you can also get a cast of this off right before a wipe to help get the team resurrected quickly after the boss despawns. Let's recap. Keep your Moonfire and Sunfire on as many targets as possible. Generate Astral Power with Solar Wrath in single target and Lunar Strike in AoE, and spend your Astral Power as much as you can with Star Surge and Starfall for single target and AoE respectively. Control the battlefield with your entangling roots. Get yourself out of bad situations by utilizing shapeshifting, dash, and bark skin. Help your healers out with healing touch and remove corruption when necessary. Use celestial alignment as much as possible and help interrupt with solar beam. Follow all of these rules and you will be well on your way to mastering the balance spec. And that's all I have for the core combat overview for the Balance Druid in Legion. This video should serve as a solid basis for you to build upon as you learn the spec, and if you'd like to keep an eye out for more videos covering balance, be sure to subscribe. Of course, if you have any questions for me about what we covered in this video, or anything in Legion for that matter, ask away in the comments below or on Twitter at @TheLoranzas. Thank you so much for watching, and as always, have fun.